Blood Money. This video is based on key insights from the book Blood Money by Peter Schweizer. Introduction. Peter Schweizer begins by drawing a parallel to a moment Winston Churchill described, where a dangerous truth was ignored by those in power. He argues that a similar situation is happening now with China, where the threats aren't bombs and battles, but sneaky actions that are harming Americans. While the recent spy balloon captured headlines, Schweizer contends that far more dangerous things are already happening, things that are causing deaths and disrupting life in the U.S. He frames this as a war, but one fought using tricks and hidden methods, inspired by the ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu, who believed the best way to win is to defeat your enemy without a direct fight. Schweizer explains that China's current strategy, as outlined in their own military writings, focuses on attacking America's weaknesses, its political system, economy, and the beliefs of its people. They call this unrestricted warfare and disintegration warfare, meaning they aim to weaken the U.S. from within. He points out that Chinese military personnel are actually required to study Sun Tzu's teachings, and the idea of winning without fighting is central to their plans. Deception is a key part of this, with a quote about the importance of trickery even displayed at their military academy. According to Schweizer, Chinese leader Xi Jinping believes that China and the West are fundamentally different, and that a long, difficult struggle is unavoidable. The author emphasizes the real and deadly consequences of this strategy, claiming that hundreds of thousands of Americans have already died as a result of these covert actions in the last 5 years, with the number growing daily. He describes this as a complex attack involving drugs, disease, propaganda, and illegal weapons, all working to create chaos and harm Americans. Schweizer is careful to distinguish between the Chinese government, the Communist Party, and the Chinese people themselves, making it clear his criticism is directed at the ruling party, not the citizens of China. Schweizer then turns to the troubling issue of why American leaders aren't doing more to address these threats. He suggests two main reasons: corruption and a reluctance to disrupt the status quo. He alleges that some leaders have financial ties to China and don't want to risk losing money or influence. Others, he argues, are simply unwilling to make the difficult changes needed to confront China, as it would upset powerful people in business and politics who benefit from the relationship. He suggests that many leaders are aware of what's happening, but choose to ignore it, finding it easier to continue as they are. The author promises to reveal specific examples of this inaction, focusing on the fentanyl crisis, social division, and the COVID-19 pandemic. He states his research is based on restricted Chinese military documents, corporate records, leaked information from government agencies, and even criminal court records, and that he will not rely on anonymous sources. He then previews several specific accusations: a president allegedly receiving money from someone linked to the fentanyl trade, a former president profiting from China after leaving office, a governor inviting Chinese criminal networks into his state, and a congressman ignoring the fentanyl crisis while involved in money laundering. Schweizer further claims that China actively worked to worsen the impact of COVID-19 in the U.S., while also pushing its own agenda. He alleges that U.S. health officials covered up information to protect China. He also plans to expose how China is using social media platforms like TikTok as cultural weapons, and how some American billionaires are funding groups that are causing chaos in American cities. He even suggests that some on the left side of American politics are being influenced by organizations connected to Beijing. Finally, he promises to reveal how Hollywood has been used to spread pro-China propaganda. The book is structured around 4 key themes, each illustrated with a proverb from ancient Chinese strategy texts. The first theme, murder with a borrowed knife, focuses on China's involvement in the fentanyl crisis, alleging that Beijing is using cartels as proxies to poison Americans, while American leaders remain silent due to corruption or self-interest. The second, Watch a Fire from Across the River, details how China is secretly fueling social unrest in the U.S. by arming gangs, supporting radical groups, and using social media bots to spread division. The third, Hide a Dagger and a Smile, explores how China is using entertainment like TikTok, movies, and video games to influence young Americans, with Hollywood benefiting financially and politicians benefiting politically. The final theme, Loot a Burning House, alleges that China exploited the COVID-19 pandemic to maximize damage to the U.S. and manipulate American leaders, with health officials covering up information to protect China. Schweizer concludes by emphasizing that these actions represent a hidden war being waged against the United States. Chapter 1: The New Opium Wars. Peter Schweizer begins by setting the stage with a meeting between President Biden and China's President Xi Jinping in 2022, highlighting a curious omission from their discussions: the fentanyl crisis. Despite its devastating impact on America, the issue was barely mentioned. A pattern Schweizer notes has been consistent throughout Biden's interactions with Xi. This sets up the central argument of the chapter, that China isn't just passively allowing fentanyl to reach the U.S., but is actively weaponizing it. Schweizer paints a grim picture of fentanyl's effects, describing victims as appearing zombie-like and detailing the sheer scale of deaths, surpassing even casualties from major American wars. He argues this isn't accidental, but a deliberate attack, a weapon of mass destruction deployed against the American people. The author emphasizes that most victims aren't knowingly taking fentanyl, but are consuming it unknowingly mixed into other drugs or counterfeit medications. He uses tragic examples, like the deaths of Prince and Tom Petty, alongside the story of West Point cadets unknowingly exposed to laced cocaine, to illustrate the widespread danger. The author then builds the case for China's intentional role, moving beyond simply acknowledging the source of fentanyl's precursor chemicals. Schweizer asserts that Beijing's involvement is far more strategic, encompassing the entire operation from chemical production to distribution and even financial transactions supporting drug cartels. He claims leaked documents, hacked emails, and corporate records reveal a level of control that suggests the fentanyl crisis is a carefully orchestrated campaign. He points out that individuals involved in these networks even hold positions of power within the Chinese government. Schweizer introduces the concept of unrestricted warfare, a Chinese military strategy outlined in a book that advocates using unconventional methods, including drug warfare, to weaken the United States. He explains that this idea, initially deemed too extreme to be publicly acknowledged, proposes destabilizing America through social chaos and a health crisis fueled by drugs. The author connects this strategy to a 2014 U.S. Army Special Operations Command White Paper that identified China's use of drug warfare against the U.S. To understand the current crisis, Schweizer takes readers back in time, detailing China's long history of involvement in the international drug trade. He recounts how, in the 1950s, China was already pushing opium into Japan and heroin into the U.S., using the profits to fund communist activities. He shares accounts from military officials and intelligence reports confirming China's deliberate efforts to undermine American troops during the Vietnam War by flooding the region with highly potent heroin. Schweizer then reveals that even as the U.S. sought to improve relations with China in the 1970s, evidence of its drug trafficking was deliberately downplayed or ignored by the Nixon administration. He explains that the desire for commercial opportunities and a strategic partnership with China led to a silencing of concerns about its involvement in the drug trade. The author highlights how reconnaissance flights over opium-producing regions were halted to avoid upsetting China, demonstrating a willingness to prioritize diplomacy over addressing a serious threat. Schweizer concludes by drawing a parallel to the Opium Wars of the 19th century, where China was victimized by Western powers. He suggests that China's current actions are motivated by a desire for revenge and a belief that weakening the U.S. is a legitimate path to regaining global power. He points to President Xi Jinping's focus on national revival and even recounts a story about his father attempting to poison a teacher, hinting at a willingness to use extreme measures to achieve political goals. The author ends by emphasizing that the fentanyl crisis is not a new phenomenon, but a continuation of decades-long Chinese strategy to undermine the United States. Chapter 2, China's Foot Soldiers. Peter Schweizer details a disturbing connection between the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, and the flow of illegal drugs into the United States, arguing it's not simply a matter of rogue criminals, but a deliberate strategy. The author explains that the CCP made a deal with powerful, historically criminal groups called triads in 1982. These triads, once rivals to the CCP, were offered a kind of protection and freedom to operate in exchange for loyalty, and, crucially, helping the CCP achieve its goals. Schweizer argues this partnership turbocharged the drug trade, providing both profit and a way to weaken a major rival, the United States. However, the story doesn't stop there. The author contends that American bankers and politicians are also involved, benefiting from the arrangement. Schweizer highlights a meeting in 1982 between Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader, and two Hong Kong tycoons, Li Ka-shing and Henry Fok, both known to have ties to the triads. Deng essentially gave these businessmen a green light to operate with limited interference, as long as they showed loyalty to the CCP. This allowed the triads to expand their drug trafficking operations, particularly heroin, into the U.S. Fok, described as a patriotic capitalist by Beijing, lived a lavish lifestyle and had connections to smuggling, while Li Ka-shing's business empire was deeply intertwined with both triads and Chinese government officials, as revealed in a Canadian intelligence report called Sidewinder. Schweizer points out that Li's financial dealings also involved close relationships with American investment bank Goldman Sachs. The author emphasizes that this wasn't just about money. The CCP actively used the triads for other purposes, running operations through the United Front Work Department, an organization dedicated to promoting the CCP's influence abroad. Schweizer details instances of Chinese military involvement in drug production, citing a 1994 Interpol tip about methamphetamine being produced in Chinese army barracks. He also notes that Chinese law enforcement often turns a blind eye to triad activities, even praising some as patriotic. This tolerance extended to allowing triad members to operate openly in Fujian province, where Xi Jinping spent 17 years as a party leader. Schweizer suggests this wasn't accidental, pointing to Xi's family connections and the presence of organized crime figures even while he was in power. Schweizer argues that the CCP's involvement deepened with the rise of synthetic drugs like fentanyl. Chinese companies began openly selling fentanyl precursors, the chemicals needed to make the drug online, often shipping them directly to the U.S. Despite promises to cooperate, the Chinese government did little to stop this flow. The author explains that the CCP allowed this to happen, and even facilitated it, by controlling the ports through which these chemicals passed, like the one in Manzanillo, Mexico, run by a company owned by Li Ka-shing. The author details how Chinese companies also supplied the pill presses used to manufacture fentanyl pills, often mislabeling them to avoid detection. The author contends that the CCP isn't just a passive observer in the drug trade. It's actively involved in every stage, from production and distribution to money laundering. He cites cases of Chinese nationals laundering cartel money through Chinese banks and using secure communication apps like WeChat, which is owned by a company with close ties to the Chinese government. Schweizer points to Admiral Craig Faller's testimony that Chinese money launderers are the know. One underwriter of drug trafficking in the Western Hemisphere. The author concludes that the CCP's actions are a deliberate attempt to destabilize the United States, using the drug trade as a weapon. Chapter 3, Willful Blindness. Peter Schweizer paints a disturbing picture of a deliberate, long-term effort by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, to weaken the United States, not through direct military conflict, but through a shadowy war waged with drugs, influence, and exploitation of American weaknesses. The chapter begins with a stark comparison to Pearl Harbor, arguing that while the attack was overt, China's actions are sneaky and destructive, yet largely ignored by American leaders. Schweizer contends that the fentanyl crisis isn't simply a drug crisis, but a calculated attack on the nation's health and stability. Schweizer details how this strategy unfolded over time, starting with the Obama administration. He argues that an initial, perhaps naive, hope for partnership with China allowed opportunities for CCP influence to grow. Obama's decision to lessen focus on the war on drugs and remove the drug czar from a key advisory role, combined with easing sanctions on Burma, a known drug source, inadvertently created openings for increased drug trafficking. The author points to financial connections between prominent Democratic donors, like Jeffrey Katzenberg of DreamWorks and the Chinese government, suggesting these relationships influenced policy decisions. A deal brokered by then-Vice President Joe Biden to facilitate DreamWorks' entry into the Chinese market is presented as evidence of prioritizing business interests over national security concerns. Schweizer also alleges a Chinese influence operation funneled money into Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. The narrative then shifts to how China seemingly grew bolder. An incident during Obama's 2016 visit to China, where he was forced to exit Air Force One through an undignified exit, is presented as a deliberate snub, signaling China's lack of respect. Despite knowing about the growing fentanyl crisis, the Obama administration, according to Schweizer, didn't seriously confront China. Agreements to restrict fentanyl precursor exports proved ineffective, and key officials like Secretary of State John Kerry didn't push the issue with Beijing. Attempts by Senator Pat Toomey to legislate against the Chinese source of fentanyl failed to gain traction. Even as the death toll climbed, the administration framed the issue as a public health crisis rather than a foreign attack. Schweizer highlights a pattern of silence and inaction continuing into the Trump and Biden administrations. He notes that while Trump publicly challenged China, the results were limited, and China dismissed the problem as an American issue. Biden, despite promises to prioritize the issue, has largely avoided directly confronting China, and the author alleges potential conflicts of interest due to the Biden family's financial dealings with individuals linked to Chinese organized crime and the fentanyl trade. Schweizer details connections between Hunter Biden and Chinese businessmen with ties to triads, Chinese criminal organizations involved in drug trafficking. He also points to financial links between members of the Biden family and individuals involved in money laundering. The author expands beyond fentanyl, revealing a network of Chinese-owned marijuana operations across the United States, particularly in California. These operations, funded by money from China, are linked to organized crime and are further fueling the drug trade. Schweizer argues that this is not accidental, but part of a broader strategy to destabilize the country. He criticizes politicians like Gavin Newsom and Mitch McConnell for their reluctance to address China's role, suggesting their financial ties and political considerations outweigh concerns about national security. Schweizer alleges that Newsom's close ties to Chinese businessmen and his efforts to cultivate relationships with the CCP have hindered his willingness to confront the issue. Schweizer concludes by emphasizing the deliberate nature of China's actions, comparing it to a form of drug warfare. He warns of even more dangerous drugs, like carfentanil and xylazine, being shipped from China, and argues that Beijing is exploiting American weaknesses to sow chaos and division. The author suggests that China's strategy is working because it's difficult to prove direct involvement, and because American politicians are often more concerned with their own interests than with protecting the country from this covert threat. He implies that a willingness to ignore the problem, driven by financial and political considerations, is allowing China to wage a silent, deadly war against the United States. Chapter 4: Arming Criminals. Peter Schweizer opens this section by detailing a disturbing trend: a dramatic rise in gun violence across America, specifically the use of fully automatic weapons. He begins with the tragic stories of Paul Cutts and Tamara O'Neill. individuals killed in shootings where modified handguns were used to fire a large number of bullets very quickly. Schweizer explains that this increase isn't due to a new type of gun, but a small, inexpensive device called a Glock switch that turns regular handguns into machine guns. What's truly alarming, according to Schweizer, is where these switches are coming from: China. He cites Sheriff Tom Dart of Cook County, Illinois, who states these devices are arriving by the thousands and are incredibly difficult to stop. Schweizer argues that this isn't just a law enforcement problem, but part of a larger, deliberate strategy by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, to weaken the United States. He describes this strategy as unrestricted warfare, a concept where a country uses unconventional methods to destabilize its rivals. This isn't about direct military conflict, but about attacking a country's values, its unity, and its overall will to function. The author explains that the CCP believes in weakening an enemy from within, exploiting existing problems to create chaos. He points to a 2013 Chinese military book, The Science of Military Strategy, which suggests targeting an enemy's soft underbelly, its politics, economy, and the beliefs of its people. The core of Schweizer's argument is that China is actively working to worsen problems already present in the US, like violence and social division. He focuses on the Glock switches as a prime example. These devices, illegal in both the US and China, are openly advertised and sold on Chinese websites to American buyers. Despite the illegality, the Chinese government hasn't done much to stop the flow, mirroring their lack of cooperation in addressing the fentanyl crisis. Schweizer highlights the shocking increase in machine gun fire detected by ShotSpotter, a gunshot detection system, jumping from 400 incidents in 2019 to 5,600 in 2021. He emphasizes that the ATF believes these switches are a major reason for the rise in mass shootings. Schweizer details how the switches are making their way into the US. Initially, they were shipped directly from China, but as law enforcement became more effective at intercepting these packages, the route changed. Now, they're increasingly sent to Mexico and smuggled across the border. Even more concerning, drug cartels in Mexico are starting to manufacture the switches themselves, using machinery supplied by Chinese companies. This mirrors the fentanyl situation, where China initially supplied the raw materials, then shifted to a land route through Mexico when direct shipments were blocked. The author notes a Department of Homeland Security memo describing this as delivery saturation, concentrated in major U.S. cities. He shares examples of individuals arrested for purchasing these switches from China, highlighting the widespread availability. Schweizer points out the hypocrisy of China's actions. While they strictly control commerce within their own borders, banning these switches, they allow their companies to openly sell them to Americans. He notes that Alibaba, a major Chinese e-commerce platform, bans sales related to sensitive political issues, but readily hosted listings for these illegal devices. The author also mentions that Chinese companies use American websites like Wish.com and even social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram to advertise the switches. Schweizer emphasizes that U.S. authorities are primarily focusing on arresting the buyers in the U.S., as they receive no cooperation from China in targeting the manufacturers. The author doesn't limit his argument to just Glock switches. He also discusses the influx of firearm suppressors, silencers, from China, another highly regulated technology. He explains that between 2019 and 2022, over 42,000 suppressors were traced back to China. Like the switches, these are advertised in English on Chinese websites and shipped with deceptive labeling. Schweizer details cases of individuals arrested with these illegally imported suppressors, highlighting their appeal to criminals and drug traffickers. Schweizer then connects this to a broader pattern of Chinese actions, referencing past attempts to smuggle weapons into the U.S. and Canada in the 1990s. He criticizes the U.S. government's response, noting that past administrations have often downplayed these incidents, prioritizing relations with China over addressing the security threat. He points out that China doesn't fully participate in international arms, tracing agreements, and even works to undermine them. Schweizer expresses frustration that U.S. leaders haven't publicly confronted China about these actions, focusing instead on domestic gun control measures. He questions why the U.S. isn't demanding accountability from China, especially considering how China would likely react if the situation were reversed. Schweizer concludes by framing these actions as part of China's larger strategy to undermine the U.S., drawing parallels to the century of humiliation narrative used by the CCP to justify its actions. He suggests that China is attempting to create a similar period of weakness and division in the United States, using tactics like weapon smuggling and exploiting social divisions. He implies that the CCP views these actions as a way to weaken America without engaging in direct conflict. Schweizer leaves the reader with a sense of urgency, questioning why U.S. leaders seem oblivious to this intentional strategy and aren't taking stronger action to counter it. Chapter 5: Magnifying Social Chaos. Peter Schweizer details a disturbing pattern of Chinese Communist Party, CCP, interference in American life, going far beyond simple spying. The chapter opens with a dramatic scene: Chinese diplomats burning documents as the U.S. orders the closure of their Houston consulate, a move prompted by concerns about espionage and stealing important ideas. But this was just the tip of the iceberg, according to Schweizer. The CCP wasn't just after secrets. They were actively trying to weaken the United States from within. Schweizer reveals a shocking allegation. The CCP was secretly working to turn the energy of the Black Lives Matter protests into something more chaotic and damaging. A report obtained by the author showed Beijing viewed American social unrest as a weakness, a way to distract and deplete the country's strength. The summer of 2020 saw widespread riots and violence following the death of George Floyd, and Schweizer argues that members of an elite Chinese military unit were actively recruiting and radicalizing Americans under the guise of supporting the protests. This wasn't about genuine support for social justice, but a calculated effort to exploit existing tensions. The author details the sheer scale of the unrest: hundreds of riots, thousands of arsons and looting incidents, and injuries to police officers, painting a picture of a nation under strain. The CCP's strategy, as outlined by Schweizer, isn't new. He explains the three warfares: public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare, a plan to undermine enemies by exploiting their weaknesses and stirring up trouble from within. This is a long-term game, targeting what the CCP sees as America's soft underbelly. The author draws a parallel to the 1960s, when Communist China saw radical groups like the Black Panther Party as useful allies to divide the U.S. Figures like Huey P. Newton, a leader of the Black Panthers, openly admired Mao Zedong and even traveled to China for support. This historical context shows a consistent pattern of Beijing seeking to amplify division within the United States. Schweizer points out the irony. China, with its own severe human rights issues, was actively fueling racial division in America. He details how the CCP has consistently criticized the U.S. on race relations, even while suppressing minority groups within its own borders. The author highlights how Beijing uses its propaganda machine to portray America as deeply flawed and racist, aiming to undermine confidence in the U.S. system. This messaging is amplified through various channels, including state-run media and online campaigns. The author then shifts focus to how the CCP attempts to influence events through seemingly unrelated groups. He describes how, during protests following the deaths of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, activists with ties to pro-Beijing organizations played a significant role in escalating the violence. One key group mentioned is Freedom Road Socialist Organization, FRSO, described as a secretive organization taking cues from Beijing. FRSO activists were reportedly brought in from out of state to participate in the Ferguson protests, and the group has a history of supporting the CCP's agenda. Schweizer emphasizes that these weren't spontaneous events, but carefully orchestrated efforts to sow discord. Schweizer also details how the CCP attempted to influence events surrounding the arrest of Peter Liang, a Chinese-American police officer, in 2016. While many in the Asian American community were genuinely concerned about potential discrimination, the author suggests that Beijing's hand was at play, with some activists allegedly bribed to amplify the narrative. This incident, along with a 2018 protest disrupted by Chinese intelligence officers in San Francisco, demonstrates the CCP's willingness to interfere in American domestic affairs, even when seemingly unrelated to national security. The chapter culminates with a disturbing account of how the CCP exploited the aftermath of George Floyd's death. Schweizer alleges that FRSO and other Beijing-linked groups actively worked to turn peaceful protests into violent riots. He highlights the role of individuals like Eugene Parrier and Brian Becker, leaders of groups with close ties to the CCP, in stoking the flames of unrest. The author also points to a coordinated online campaign originating from China to amplify anger and division. The narrative suggests that the CCP saw the chaos as an opportunity to weaken the U.S. and advance its own interests. Schweizer concludes by raising serious questions about the true motivations of individuals and groups involved in the protests, suggesting that some may have been unknowingly serving the CCP's agenda. The author's investigation reveals a complex web of influence and manipulation, painting a troubling picture of a foreign power actively working to undermine American society. Chapter 6: Destabilizing Democracy. Peter Schweizer details a concerning pattern of activity by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, aimed at weakening the United States from within. The chapter begins with a mysterious arrival in Houston, Texas, in 2020, Chinese intelligence officers posing as researchers. These weren't tourists. They were members of the People's Liberation Army, China's military, working undercover. They teamed up with Huawei, a tech company with close ties to the Chinese military, to identify Americans who might be drawn to protests, even violent ones. Shockingly, they even created TikTok videos designed to encourage unrest and division. The U.S. government eventually closed the Houston consulate, discovering evidence of technology theft and spying. But the extent of the officers' involvement in stirring up trouble remained largely unacknowledged. Schweizer questions why this aspect of the story received so little attention, suggesting the political climate surrounding the George Floyd protests made it difficult to openly discuss potential foreign interference. He raises a chilling question. If this unit had gone undetected, how much more chaos could they have caused? And are there other similar groups operating secretly across the country? The author introduces Paul Dabroa, an expert in artificial intelligence, who explains that it doesn't take a majority to destabilize a country. Just 1% of the population needs to be radicalized. Dabroa points out how easily people can be influenced using modern technology. The CCP's interest in using social media to create problems in other countries isn't new. Schweizer cites a Chinese military manual from 2015 that discusses using the internet to launch color revolutions, essentially using social media to incite unrest. The chapter then focuses on Unit 61716, a secretive Chinese military unit based in Fuzhou, China. This unit is at the heart of China's three warfares strategy, using media, psychology, and legal tactics to wear down enemies by exploiting their weaknesses. The unit specifically researches political polarization in America, aiming to deepen existing divisions. Schweizer notes that during the 2020 protests, the Chinese government openly supported the protesters, using state-run media to amplify their message and criticize the United States. Cartoons published by Chinese newspapers depicted the U.S. in a negative light, highlighting racism and inequality. This echoes a historical pattern, as the CCP previously supported radical groups in America during the 1960s and 70s, like the Black Panthers. A Chinese journalist even suggested renewing that alliance with a new generation of activists. The author then shifts focus to a more recent and insidious operation, the use of fake social media accounts. He describes how accounts posing as ordinary Americans, like Laura Daniels and Spencer Taggart, were actually created in China to spread divisive messages and amplify existing tensions. These fake accounts were designed to make Americans feel hopeless and distrustful of their government. Schweizer explains that for Chinese strategists, division is an opportunity. Their goal isn't just to create anger, but to erode American pride and create disgust. Schweizer draws a comparison to the Cold War, when the Soviet Union also tried to exploit racial tensions in the US, but lacked the tools to do so effectively. Today, social media provides a powerful weapon for spreading disinformation and manipulating public opinion. He points to Twitter's removal of 170,000 fake accounts linked to a Chinese government influence campaign during the 2020 election as evidence of this. The author highlights China's ambition to retake the internet battlefield and its strategy of amplifying extreme viewpoints rather than taking sides. The chapter then introduces Neville Royce Singham, an American billionaire who now lives in China and has become a major funder of radical groups in the United States. Singham made his fortune with a software company he sold to a firm partly owned by the Chinese government. He's a strong supporter of the CCP and has close ties to Huawei. Schweizer details how Singham's money flows through organizations like the People's Support Foundation to groups that promote radical agendas, including those that support violent protests. Schweizer explains that Singham's funding supports groups like CODPINK and the People's Forum, which are actively working to shift American public opinion in favor of China. He also points to the Kaio Collective, a mysterious group that promotes pro-China views within the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA. The author notes that despite the DSA's progressive values, it often avoids criticizing the Chinese government's human rights abuses. Schweizer highlights how members of Congress affiliated with the DSA voted against a resolution to investigate the CCP's influence. The chapter concludes with examples of ongoing Chinese influence operations, including the use of fake accounts to spread disinformation during the 2022 midterm elections and the coordinated support for protests following the death of Tyre Nichols. Schweizer emphasizes that China's approach is more sophisticated than Russia's, and that Beijing is actively working to sow panic, fear, and distrust in the United States. He suggests that the U.S. government has been slow to recognize and address this threat, and that the CCP is exploiting divisions within American society to achieve its goals. Chapter 7, A Tick-Toking Bomb. Peter Schweizer paints a worrying picture of how China is quietly trying to weaken the United States, not with armies, but with sneaky plans that mess with people's heads and daily lives. The chapter focuses on TikTok, a super popular app, but it's much more than just silly dances and funny videos. Schweizer argues it's a tool the Chinese government is using to influence Americans, especially young people. He starts with a scary example: false reports spreading on TikTok about Russia attacking Sweden, causing panic among kids who then worried their parents. This wasn't a random event, Schweizer explains, but shows how easily the app can be used to spread fear and confusion. The author emphasizes that TikTok isn't just a neutral platform. It's controlled by ByteDance, a Chinese company closely tied to the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. This connection is key because the CCP has openly talked about cognitive warfare, a way to win without fighting by changing how people think. Schweizer points to writings by Chinese military leaders who see apps like TikTok as weapons to influence the West. They want to change our values and make us question our own beliefs, all without firing a shot. The author illustrates this by explaining how the algorithm, the system that decides what videos you see, is designed to keep you hooked and can be used to push certain ideas. Schweizer doesn't stop at TikTok. He highlights a disturbing trend of neurological problems popping up in young girls in Los Angeles, which doctors are calling TikTok tics. These are involuntary movements and sounds that seem to be linked to spending too much time on the app, overstimulating their brains. This, he argues, is another example of the app's harmful effects. He then broadens the scope, suggesting that China is using a variety of tools, apps, video games, even movies, to subtly influence Americans. The author details how TikTok gained popularity in the US, with help from American celebrities like Jimmy Fallon and Ellen DeGeneres, who promoted it without seeming to understand the risks. He also points out that major American companies, like the NFL, partnered with TikTok, seemingly ignoring the potential dangers. This shows, according to Schweizer, a willingness to overlook the Chinese connection for profit or popularity. He stresses that while TikTok appears harmless on the surface, behind the scenes, it's a carefully crafted tool for manipulation. Schweizer explains that the Chinese government doesn't even allow its own citizens to use TikTok. Instead, they have a different version called Douyin, which focuses on education and positive content. This contrast, he argues, shows that China understands the harmful effects of the app and is protecting its own people while exposing the rest of the world to a potentially damaging influence. He notes that people spend a huge amount of time on TikTok, over 80 minutes a day on average, making them especially vulnerable to its influence. The author dives into the inner workings of ByteDance, revealing that the company has a Communist Party committee that oversees its operations. This committee ensures that the app aligns with the CCP's goals and promotes socialist core values. Schweizer emphasizes that ByteDance isn't just a tech company. It's deeply intertwined with the Chinese government and its intelligence services. He points out that the algorithm itself is considered a state secret, meaning its inner workings are hidden from the public. Schweizer concludes by highlighting the hypocrisy of American politicians and celebrities who embrace TikTok while ignoring the warnings about its dangers. He argues that the CCP is actively trying to undermine American values and influence elections, and TikTok is a key part of that strategy. He warns that this is a long-term game, and if the US doesn't take action, it risks losing its cultural and ideological independence. The author suggests that China's goal isn't necessarily to defeat the US in a traditional war, but to weaken it from within by changing how Americans think and believe. Chapter 8, Digital Entertainment. Peter Schweizer details a growing concern: the influence of Chinese companies, particularly those with ties to the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, within the American video game industry. He argues this isn't just about entertainment, but a deliberate strategy to subtly shape American culture and gather information. Like the popular app TikTok, video games can be addictive and collect a lot of personal data from players. Schweizer points out that these games are designed to keep people playing, similar to how slot machines work, offering small rewards to keep players hooked. He notes a significant shift over the last 2 decades, where American, Japanese, and European companies once dominated the gaming world, but now many are owned by Chinese entities. Schweizer highlights specific examples. ByteDance, the company behind TikTok, acquired Mountain Technology, which makes the mobile game Mobile Legends. Bang Bang. More importantly, he focuses on Tencent, a massive Chinese tech company with reported origins in Chinese intelligence. Tencent doesn't just create games. It also collaborates with the Chinese military to improve their artificial intelligence for warfare. The author explains that Tencent has invested heavily in the US gaming market, acquiring stakes in major companies like Activision, Blizzard. The deal was blocked due to antitrust concerns, Riot Games, and Epic Games. This widespread investment, Schweizer emphasizes, is actively supported by the Chinese government. The potential for data collection is a major worry for Schweizer. Riot Games, fully owned by Tencent, allows data transfer to anyone and complies with Chinese laws, meaning the government can access that data. Epic Games, creator of Fortnite, is 40% owned by Tencent. While Epic's founder claims Tencent doesn't have access to player data, there's no public requirement to prove it, and their terms of service allow for data sharing with foreign governments. The author points out that gamers often provide real names, payment information, and even voice samples, which could be used for creating deep fakes. This data, Schweizer argues, is valuable for improving AI and could be used for military purposes. Schweizer also illustrates how these games are designed to appeal to young Americans. Fortnite, for example, has a large percentage of players between 18 and 24. These games aren't just about playing. They're social spaces where people connect and even attend virtual events like concerts. This gives Chinese companies access to and influence over a young audience. He quotes Abhishek Prakash, who believes China is using games to build global power, and references a CCP textbook stating that controlling communication means controlling cultural values. The author notes that despite these concerns, banning these games seems unlikely, as Wei Cern Ling believes Americans won't easily give up their favorite games. Schweizer then introduces Showa American Story, a game created by a Chinese company that presents a distorted view of American history, portraying the U.S. as a colony of Japan. This game, he argues, demonstrates the CCP's goal of spreading its own narrative through entertainment. The CCP actively encourages game developers to incorporate propaganda into their games, holding forums to discuss how to best promote their ideology. Schweizer concludes by highlighting Genshin Impact, another popular Chinese game, and points out that its success is seen by the CCP as a way to spread Chinese culture. He reiterates that, like TikTok, these Chinese gaming companies are ultimately answerable to the Chinese government and intelligence services, raising serious questions about data security and the potential for manipulation. Chapter 9: The People's Republic of Hollywood. Peter Schweizer details how the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, is quietly gaining influence in the United States, not just through things like TikTok, but also through Hollywood. It's a surprising place to find a power struggle, but Schweizer argues that nearly every major movie studio now works with Chinese companies for money and help getting films shown in China. This isn't just about business, it's about control. Companies like Hewlett Brothers Media and Perfect World Pictures are key players, funneling money into American films and, with it, CCP influence. This influence means the CCP gets a say in what stories are told on the big screen. Schweizer explains that when Hollywood studios partner with Chinese companies, they become legally responsible to the CCP's propaganda department. This department can decide what gets included in a film and what doesn't, even subtly adding messages that benefit the CCP. It's like having a secret editor who wants to make sure movies show China in a good light. The author points to the Russo brothers, directors of hugely popular Marvel movies, as an example. While their films often question American institutions, they happily worked on a Chinese action movie called Wolf Warrior 2, which openly praises the Chinese government and even shows a character giving the middle finger with a pro-China message. Schweizer highlights the irony of the Russo brothers criticizing surveillance in America while helping to promote a film made by a country with the world's most extensive surveillance system. They didn't just offer creative advice on Wolf Warrior 2, they connected the filmmakers with American special effects experts and even helped cast an American actor as the villain. The author notes that the Russo brothers company, AGBO, received a large investment from a Chinese film company, and they even started a studio with offices in both Los Angeles and Beijing. They claimed they were turning to China because the American film industry lacked independence, a statement Schweizer finds questionable given the CCP's tight control over its own film industry. The author emphasizes that this isn't just about a few individuals. Even powerful figures like Steven Spielberg and Jeffrey Katzenberg are making deals with Chinese companies, meaning their films are also subject to CCP review. Schweizer points out that of the top 100 highest-grossing movies between 2014 and 2018, over 40 had Chinese investors. These films often feature Chinese characters in positive roles, sometimes at the expense of American ones. For example, in the movie The Martian, an American astronaut is rescued by Chinese technology. Schweizer details how the CCP's influence extends to changing storylines to avoid offending the Chinese government. In the movie Doctor Strange, a character who was originally Tibetan in the comic books was changed to Celtic to avoid upsetting Beijing. He also notes a trend of fewer dark-skinned actors in films made for the Chinese market, suggesting a preference for lighter skin tones. The author uses the Kung Fu Panda series as a case study. The first film was a fun, individual story, but as the series continued and received Chinese funding, it shifted to emphasize collective values and praise Chinese culture. Schweizer provides further examples, like the animated film Abominable, which included a map showing China's disputed claims in the South China Sea. Even children's movies are being used to subtly promote China's political agenda. He also discusses films like The Great Wall and Midway, which were altered to portray China in a more favorable light. In World War Z, a scene suggesting the zombie virus originated in China was removed. Schweizer argues that these changes aren't accidental. They're a deliberate effort to shape how the world views China. The author concludes that these co-productions consistently lean towards a pro-Beijing perspective, subtly endorsing China and sometimes diminishing America's standing. Chapter 10, Social Engineering a Pandemic. Peter Schweizer paints a disturbing picture of China's actions during and leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic, arguing it wasn't simply a health crisis, but a calculated opportunity for the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, to gain power and weaken the United States. The author details how, even before the world knew the severity of the situation, evidence suggested something was wrong in Wuhan, China, with a surge in hospital visits and online searches for symptoms like cough and diarrhea. Yet, the CCP actively concealed this information, even removing a database of virus samples from public access, while simultaneously preparing for what they saw as a chance to advance their global influence. Schweizer asserts that the CCP viewed the pandemic as a new kind of warfare, a chance to exploit the chaos and demonstrate the supposed failings of Western systems. This wasn't just about letting the virus spread, according to the author, but actively manipulating the situation to their advantage. A key part of this manipulation involved controlling the supply of essential medical equipment. While the world desperately needed masks, gowns, and ventilators, China began hoarding these supplies, increasing imports while drastically decreasing exports. This created a shortage in the West, allowing Beijing to profit and exert influence. The author highlights how China then obscured these actions with misleading trade data, denying any export restrictions while quietly buying up vital resources. The author details how China didn't just profit from the medical supply shortage, but also actively worked to shape the response to the virus in the United States and Europe. Schweizer points to the influential reports from Imperial College London, which advocated for strict lockdowns similar to those implemented in China. He reveals connections between the researchers and China, including visits from Chinese leader Xi Jinping and research funding from Chinese entities. These reports, based on flawed data provided by the CCP, created a sense of panic and led Western leaders to adopt policies that mirrored China's authoritarian approach. Schweizer suggests this was a deliberate strategy to promote the Chinese model of governance as superior. Schweizer emphasizes that this wasn't a passive acceptance of events, but a proactive effort to undermine the U.S. response. He describes how Chinese intelligence operatives launched cyberattacks against American biotech firms working on vaccine development, attempting to steal research and disrupt progress. Simultaneously, Chinese-linked hackers stole millions of dollars in U.S. COVID relief funds. The author also points to the coordinated effort to control the narrative, with Chinese state media pushing propaganda praising China's response while criticizing the West. The author illustrates how Beijing used its influence to silence dissent and promote its agenda. He cites examples of Chinese officials pressuring the U.S. to downplay criticism of China's handling of the pandemic, threatening to cut off medical supplies if the U.S. continued to demand accountability. Schweizer also highlights how Chinese-linked groups actively worked to influence public opinion, spreading disinformation and attacking those who questioned China's actions. The author notes the curious case of Dr. Anthony Fauci, who initially downplayed the threat of the virus and later embraced lockdown measures, seemingly influenced by information provided by Chinese officials. Schweizer concludes that the CCP exploited the pandemic to advance its political and ideological goals, weakening the United States and promoting its own authoritarian system. He draws a parallel to the attack on Pearl Harbor, arguing that the U.S. response to China's actions has been shockingly inadequate. The author suggests that the death toll from COVID-19 far exceeds the losses at Pearl Harbor, yet the U.S. has failed to hold Beijing accountable for its role in the crisis. The chapter serves as a warning about the dangers of relying on an adversary for critical information and the importance of protecting national interests in the face of global threats. Chapter 11, A Cover-Up for China and Themselves. Peter Schweizer's chapter dives deep into a troubling question. Why did the COVID-19 pandemic begin in Wuhan, China? From the start, top American health officials privately wondered if there was more to the story than met the eye, and Schweizer lays out a case suggesting a deliberate cover-up occurred, motivated by a desire to protect China's reputation and potentially hide its involvement. The author details how concerns about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a research lab conducting risky experiments with bat coronaviruses, were quickly downplayed. Virologist Ian Lipkin warned Dr. Fauci about the nightmare of circumstantial evidence, given the scale of research happening in Wuhan, but Fauci seemed more worried about blaming China than finding the truth. Schweizer reveals a pattern of reluctance from key figures like Fauci and Dr. Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, to seriously investigate the virus's origins. They feared accusations against China would harm international relations, even as evidence mounted that Beijing was withholding information and manipulating data. The author points to emails showing Fauci actively discouraged discussion of China's responsibility, preferring to dismiss such ideas as wild speculations. This reluctance, Schweizer argues, was directly tied to a fear of revealing China's potential culpability. He highlights how even when presented with evidence of China's extreme lockdown measures and questionable case numbers, Fauci seemed uninterested in assigning blame. The chapter introduces the role of Peter Daszak, head of the EcoHealth Alliance, a group that funded research at the Wuhan lab. Schweizer portrays Daszak as a key player in steering the narrative away from a potential lab leak. EcoHealth received U.S. government funding, including from Fauci's institute, and then funneled those dollars to the Wuhan lab. Daszak actively worked to discredit the lab leak theory, even going so far as to downplay his own earlier research suggesting bat coronavirus spillover was rare. Schweizer details how Daszak and other scientists dismissed the idea of a lab leak, fearing it would damage scientific collaboration with China. Schweizer emphasizes that some Chinese scientists did believe the virus originated from a lab, noting that the Wuhan wet market, initially blamed for the outbreak, didn't even sell bats. Despite this, U.S. officials seemed determined to align with the Chinese Communist Party's CCP narrative. The author points to the World Health Organization's WHO investigation, which was heavily influenced by Daszak and dismissed the lab leak theory as extremely unlikely. Schweizer argues this investigation was more of a cover-up than a genuine attempt to find the truth. The author reveals a coordinated effort to suppress discussion of a lab leak, including a letter published in The Lancet condemning conspiracy theories. Schweizer exposes how Fauci orchestrated this letter, curiously excluding the head of the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, Robert Redfield, who believed a lab leak was possible. Emails obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests show Daszak attempting to cover up his involvement in the letter and coordinating with colleagues to control the narrative. He even acknowledged receiving threats against Chinese colleagues from those pushing the lab leak theory. Schweizer details how Daszak actively worked to prevent the release of Chinese genome data, fearing unwelcome attention. He also resisted turning over EcoHealth's research to the U.S. government, claiming it would be misused by conspiracy theorists. The author highlights the close ties between the Wuhan lab and the Chinese military, noting the lab was built with assistance from France but ultimately taken over by China. He points out the presence of Communist Party committees within the lab, raising questions about the independence of the research. The chapter concludes by revealing that the Wuhan lab was conducting dangerous gain-of-function research, altering viruses to make them more infectious. Schweizer explains that this research, funded in part by U.S. taxpayer dollars, was considered risky even by some scientists. He details how researchers had warned about the potential for a lab accident to spark a pandemic, and how the virus that emerged in Wuhan shared characteristics, suggesting it may have been engineered. Schweizer argues that powerful forces within the U.S. government actively worked to protect China and suppress the truth about the origins of COVID-19, potentially at the cost of millions of lives. Conclusion. Peter Schweizer argues that China isn't fighting a traditional war with the United States, but something much sneakier and more dangerous. He believes Beijing is waging an unrestricted war, meaning they're using all sorts of methods to weaken America, and many people don't even realize it's happening. The author's research points to actions causing real harm to Americans, and he's frustrated by what he sees as a weak response from U.S. leaders. He suggests some leaders might be ignoring the problem because they're getting rich or don't want to upset China, and a few might even agree with China's goals. A big part of Schweizer's concern centers around the fentanyl crisis. He doesn't see it as just a tragic accident, but as a direct result of China's actions. He explains that China is the main source of the chemicals used to make fentanyl, a powerful and deadly drug. The author believes China knowingly allows these chemicals to be shipped to the U.S., causing countless overdoses and deaths. He points to the recent Stop Chinese Fentanyl Act of 2023 as a small step forward, but worries whether it will actually be enforced, or if leaders will be too afraid to confront China. Schweizer also argues that China is trying to influence what Americans think and believe. He points to TikTok, the popular video app, as a tool for spreading ideas that could be harmful to the U.S. He also suggests that China is influencing Hollywood, the American movie industry, to promote certain messages. This, he says, is a form of mental casualties, where people are being subtly indoctrinated. It's like slowly changing someone's mind without them even realizing it. The author doesn't stop at drugs and social media. He highlights a long list of other concerning activities, like secret Chinese police stations operating on U.S. soil, Chinese companies buying up farmland near military bases, and stealing valuable technology from American businesses. He notes that while some law enforcement and politicians are trying to address these issues, their efforts are often blocked by political opposition. For example, he mentions the Department of Justice challenging a Florida law that tried to limit Chinese land ownership near military installations. Schweizer questions who the DOJ is really protecting. Schweizer believes the core problem is that many U.S. leaders still believe China wants a win-win relationship where both countries benefit. He strongly disagrees. His research, he says, shows that China has clear, malign intent towards the United States, meaning they want to harm and defeat America. He argues that U.S. policy should be based on this understanding, and that we need a strong, united strategy to defend ourselves. He dismisses the idea that China's internal problems will magically solve the issue, arguing they might make China more desperate and aggressive. He ends with a powerful statement, saying that, unlike in the past, the problem isn't a lack of people willing to fight, but a lack of leaders willing to defend the country. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.